Good afternoon. My name is Dustin Dupas, Chief Operating Officer with TABS Analytics. In today's webinar, we'll review the results from the TABS 4th Annual Food and Beverage Study. We'll look at 15 of the largest categories of our industry and talk about the sales trends, the demographics, and the buyer preferences on using promotions and outlets for shopping. Our next webinar will be the 3rd Annual Cosmetics Study and will take place on November 16th at this same time, 2 p.m. Eastern. We'll be joined by a guest speaker, Women's Marketing CEO, Andrea Van Dam. She'll bring women's marketing's unique perspective and experience on the beauty shopper. Presenting today is Dr. Kurt Jetta, CEO and founder of TABS Analytics. At the end of the presentation, we'll open the floor to questions that you can submit via the chat box on the GoToWebinar screen. With that, I'll turn it over to Dr. Jetta.
Thank you, and thank you again to all those of you attending today's webinar. I'm going to assume, probably best that I assume that none of you have attended a webinar before, so I'll go through some of the background, kind of do this enough times. It gets a little repetitive, but I'm sure there's the majority of you are new to these webinars, but most of them are done with surveys. So we talk to 1,000 people, adults 18 plus, nationally representative, and then we balance the data based on age and gender to align with the national census. We've been doing the same methodology for the last 4 years. We've been doing this study. And similarly, the questions are the same as well. So for those of you that have attended in the past, we used to call it consumables. A little bit hard for people to understand exactly what that meant, so we just called it food and beverage, but the questionnaire is identical. We're asking 15 categories that are a good bellwether for the industry overall, because they represent 20% of total CPG retail dollars, and there's some of the marquee categories: cookies, carb bev, water, juices. You can see the list here. We also asked strong agreement on what types of deals they use, and we always have the same consistent list of 10 tactics. We asked about their agreement on some trendy topics such as organics, or how are they heavy online buyers overall, and then finally, where are they purchasing groceries. So we don't ask specific grocery banner breaks. We did ask Walmart neighborhood, but we asked just as in general the overall grocery channel. And then we do our own checks, both internal data validity to make sure the data is consistent across all the questions, as well as corroborating with external industry sources. And we'll talk about as we go throughout this study. So let's get into what we're going to review. Well, we'll look at the category trends both as an aggregate sector as well as the 15 specific categories. Demographics, who's buying them? What are the deal preferences of these buyers? Where are they buying the products? What are their attitudes towards certain on-trend concepts? When we're talking about various buyer groups, there's some definitions I want to confirm. First of all, we'll talk about very heavy buyers in the context of specific categories, so cereal or water or sports drinks. And we define those as people that are buying the category at least once a month based on their reported purchasing. We're putting those responses on a 5-point scale from the low end of purchase frequency to the high end. We add all those up, and then we create a sector total of total consumables, and a heavy buyer then is defined by anybody that has 55 points based on that scaling we use of 15 categories. So to get that designation, you really have to have a breadth of heavy purchasing. Just buying, being a hardcore buyer of soft drinks, 3 times a week isn't going to put you at the level of a heavy buyer, because that only gets you a heavy buying in one category. And then finally, a heavy deal user, anybody that uses 6 of the 10 tactics regularly, and they have to say they agree strongly that these are tactics that they use regularly. So first of all, let's talk about what are the trends versus last year. I'll give you the lay of the land on the chart here. So we're looking at annual reported purchases per respondent. So if we take the top one, sports drinks, you can 3.85 to 3.96 from 13 to 14, meaning the first year they made 3.85 per year. That went up to 3.96. So this is weighted for non-buyers as well, so they get a 0 by definition. We then look at the 2016 data. There's a visual of the trend, the year-to-year growth. Then we adjust that purchases for the 2016 based on population growth over the 4 years, which we know to be 2.4% based on the U.S. Census. And that gets us to an adjusted CAGR, or compounded annual growth rate, over those 4 years. So this data is ranked by that growth rate, and a couple things come out. So of the 15 categories, only 4 show any growth, and that growth is rather anemic as far as total purchasing. In fact, you see it at an off-cited complaint of a lot of major retailers that they're seeing a decline in trips. Certainly Target talked about that in their last quarterly earnings. And we see overall across these 15 high-velocity, high-traffic categories, there's a down 1% per year. Last year we were down 2%, or in 2016, 2%, which is a moderation, a deceleration from when we dropped 4% from 14 to 15. So there does seem to be some moderation in the decline. But you can look at some of these categories down here that are in really bad shape. You can see the juices, shelf juice and refrigerated juice. You see cereal, popcorn, all posting fairly consistent declines over the last 4 years, and you can see particularly juice, which and you would infer that it's water and other beverages replacing that. Coffee, certainly. So now what's causing that decline in purchasing? So first of all, I wanted to look at, are there less people buying this category? So what we're doing is, this is change 2016 versus 2015. Is it a function of category penetration? You see that on the x-axis. On the y-axis is what we're trying to explain. Purchases per buyer, you see the data over here. You can both see by the data and by the relative lack of fit in the graph, it doesn't seem to be a function of less people buying, because the majority, the 12 out of the 15, had a decline in penetration, but roughly half showed some type of increase in purchases per buyer. And the reason we infer on why penetration doesn't go far in explaining changes is because these are already very high penetration categories. You can see they're all in the 70s and 80s, and even salty snack is at 90. Sports drink is at 50%. And it's probably no coincidence that they've had the highest sustained level of growth over the last 4 years. So it's not category penetration. What could it be? Well, it's very strongly points to the change in very heavy buyers. I mean, look at that fit as we look at it's 91%. And this isn't a straight linear relationship. There's a diminishing return aspect, so it's a quadratic function that will peak at some point. But you can see very clearly where there are declines in the number of very heavy buyers, those hardcore buyers that are buying you at least once a month. That's highly correlated to a reduction in purchases per buyer. So that's where, as a category manager or as somebody that's involved in the category, we want to focus our efforts on understanding those hardcore buyers, those heavy users. And so that's what we'll talk about. So one of the things we know, and this is sector overall, not just any specific category, is that households with kids are the highest demographic for these categories. So what we're looking at is the percent of people in a particular demographic group that are heavy sector buyers overall. So it's important to note that not only are households with kids the heaviest buyers, but they are the ones seeing the steepest declines. In fact, that's a very consistent and pretty stark decline. And that, more than anything, is explaining the softness in the industry, is how far they've fallen. I mean, they're still the number one demographic, but that gap is closing with some of these other demographics. But you can still see 35% of the households with kids are heavy buyers, only 20% of households without kids. So it's a big explanatory variable. The vaunted millennials, I mean, they're right about the average of the U.S., so there's nothing particularly noteworthy as far as their level of heavy buying. They aren't particularly heavy buyers. If you look at kind of a general trend, you see that the rate of heavy purchasing goes up, peaks around 35 to 54, and then starts coming down pretty dramatically. We talked about the kids, and the income, there's a slight increase as well. And there actually kind of gets almost very diminishing marginal gains once you get past the $75,000 income, which would suggest that people in the very highest income then start spending on other things. Once they bought their CPG, their consumables, they're now turning to leisure activities, and as we know, there's a big shift toward electronics in the industry, or really in the economy overall. As we probe further demographic insights, there's nothing that really stands out majorly as we look at county or ethnicity. It is interesting to see that non-Hispanic blacks have the highest level of heavy sector purchasing, but it's also important to note that these tend to be fairly volatile in the research, and that makes the trend on households with kids even more noteworthy, is how consistent and how negative it's been. If we look at then that households with kids even further, we see that that split is really notable in every single category except for a few. And what's problematic about that is we work with a lot of companies where I just did one about a year ago where their marketing plan had 50 pages dedicated to talking about millennials and absolutely none talking about households with kids. And this was in the juices area, and you can see that there's a pretty dramatic difference between very heavy purchasing between households with kids and without kids. And you can see it, as I mentioned, across the board. It's interesting here, households without kids going up, and with the salty snacks going up with households without kids, probably because of a lot of the better-for-you type of products on the market. Candy, there's not much of a gap, so a lot of adults buying bag candy and throughout the year, so it's not just for kids and not just for treats anymore. So I mean, just it reinforces again and there was an article recently on cereal. Why are cereals having a hard time attracting millennials? They need to focus on getting the act together with their hardcore buyers, the households with kids, which it seems like they've stabilized that decline quite a bit. Well, one of the areas we know that really affects very heavy buying and sector buying overall is deals, and I've had multiple webinars, and I'd encourage you to go to webinars.tabsgroup.com to get a little bit more background on a lot of the research we've done in this area. But basically what we see is a very high correlation, and actually we've kind of definitively proved it's a causation between more deals and more sales. So we're looking at the continuum of light to heavy buyers at the top, and then light to heavy deal buyers going down the side. The holy grail for the people in the industry is to get lots of heavy buyers without having to subsidize them with any deals. That's trying to train them to get off the needle. And there is some evidence it's worked, and certainly you can put in another 20 years and try and get that trend. Maybe you'll be at somewhere that is meaningful, but I mean, still we're talking about only 5.4% of the population falls into this designation. But we see the consistent trend. The more we deal, the more people are purchasing, but there's also a very interesting, this diminishing return, and you see it both ways. So heavy deal buyers aren't more likely to be heavy consumables buyers, but they are more likely to be medium buyers than they are light buyers. In fact, more than twice as likely. So what this suggests is a level of diminishing return on the number of tactics being employed, and we're going to look at some of those specific tactics. And we asked about 10 of them. So the question is, do you really need to offer all 10, or if you have a good solid portfolio of 3 or 4 types of deals that you're offering your consumers, is that going to be adequate? And I think we'll see in some of these trends the answer is yes. So what we do know is that there's also this correlation between the heavy deal participation and the trends that we've been tracking. So if you look at heavy deal drop-off from 14 to 15. That coincides with a pretty big drop-off in average purchases per buyer. And then we see a much more moderate drop-off this past year, which coincides with a moderate drop-off in the purchases per buyer. We know that this is very important to consumers. 90% of the consumers, the shoppers that say they use at least one of the 10 tactics. So all consumers pretty much are actively engaged in at least one type of deal search behavior, and almost 2/3 of them that use 3. So there are this constituency that has this arsenal, this portfolio of deals that they're looking at. And when we look at deals, we think about it in terms of active deal participation and passive deals participation. Active is where I have to cut coupons or actively look to get a deal, shop at different stores, whereas passive is just I show up at the store like in a private label or EDLP and I get the deal. And so that deal activity is pretty much stabilized in 2016. Slight drop off in the heavy active deal buyers, but certainly, I mean, it's still well below where it was 2 years ago. We call that the discouraged deal shopper phenomenon. So a lot of and we've well documented the change in promotional tactics is driving a lot of these consumers away based on our own research and corroborated by a lot of industry evidence. Passive seems to stabilize. Here's the tactics we're talking about. A lot of interesting dynamics underway. First of all, you see what's the most popular: shopping for deals, circular still most popular, and active deal tactics, passive deal tactics or EDLP, and then to a lesser extent PVL. You can see the growth in these tactics year over year. There's been a consistent decline in FSIs, and actually a very notable decline. It's kind of, I would say, a worrisome decline. But there's also a decline in online couponing. So it's not as if there's a switching of the preferred way to get a coupon. It's just people really aren't using coupons as much overall over this period of time. Whereas all these other tactics see some stability since the big drop-off from 2014. We also see a noteworthy drop-off in bonus packs. You can actually see that through some of the Nielsen IRI data as well. Just manufacturers just aren't using them as much, and so that's an area where corroborating our data to what we see with other reliable industry sources. So now we'll kind of indulge in our obsession with millennials, or some people's obsession. So let's look at how they use deal tactics. So this is the percentages that they're using, and you can see how low FSIs are, and particularly when we overlay all adults with these green lines. I mean, there's a consistently lower level of active deal participation. I mean, you can't get those lazy slackers off the couch for nothing, it appears. I mean, God forbid they put a little effort in to save your mom and dad a little money, because, I mean, well, at least 1/3 of them that are still living at home, at least based on some of the industry data we see. But here's where the two areas interesting, kind of those old school tactics of circulars and FSIs are really below. So that would suggest, and this is where it is, in fact, being somewhat facetious, not too facetious, somewhat facetious in maligning the millennials, but you do get an insight into the future. And we're talking 10, 15 years down the road, not next year. But certainly it has implications on how consumers are going to want to get their deals. I mean, it's unlikely. It could, when their life stage changed, you could see those numbers go up, but that's just a very big and interesting gap. And then if we look at the passive deal tactics, you actually see one, large sizes, which seems counterintuitive, because they don't have a whole lot of people to buy for, but maybe it's their way of getting value. But you see lower on EDLP and some of these other things. So certainly some interesting insights into how millennials get deals. And, it's not as if online coupons are just, driving a bunch of appeal either. They're actually slightly below the national average. And what we also see from our work, and let me just go back to that, is just online coupons. Not only are they lowering appeal, but we've done extensive research looking at the impact, or actually lack of impact, that these coupons have. And I mean, it's just kind of screaming into a dark cave that they don't work. And talking to one client, they said, well, you know, we don't budget for them anyway. We don't really spend a whole lot on them. And it's like, so what are you doing them for? I mean, boy, just think about what you're doing. I mean, if it's not working, then why do you keep doing it? I mean, I mean, they're being pumped out more and more per Kantar, 17% increase. The appeal is going down, and they don't work at all anyway. So somehow that's certainly one tactic that can be dropped, and even if it's minimal amount of money, reallocate that to something else. Now let's take a look at where people are buying. So grocery still dominates, and of this, 78% of the people that buy at a traditional grocery store, with 10% penetration of Walmart neighborhood. This is the first year we've asked about that. Probably many of you have read about the woes Target is having in grocery. That certainly comes up in our research as well. You see a pretty significant drop-off in the percentage of people making regular purchases, and this is a low threshold. It only requires 6. And we know through looking at household panel data, the typical retailer is getting well over 20 trips per year. Now again, this is just consumable, so you don't expect it to be that high, but 6 is putting a very low threshold to be considered a low regular purchasing. We have a drop in discount grocer such as Aldi, which I talked a lot about last year, how significant it was. And what I'm suspecting is that people were perceiving Trader Joe's as a discount grocer. This is the first time we asked about that. So we're not ready to say for sure that there's been a drop-off in that, and certainly the external evidence does not suggest that to be the case. But it does suggest that maybe it's not quite as big of a channel overall as our research last year suggested. Rite Aid dropped off a bit. Everybody else was pretty stable. We actually see, God forbid, a very modest gain in online. And I had to break out the decimals here to show what kind of impact it was, because otherwise it's just a straight line of 4%. But in fact, it did go up from 3.9 to 4.5. But that's extremely small. I mean, Rite Aid's getting more regular buyers, and the total channel of online, for crying out loud. I mean, that's not a very good result. I mean, a Rite Aid's a drugstore, but they're still getting more consumables purchases with not, a totally national footprint either than the entirety of online grocer and all the effort and time and what people are doing with online. So if we take all that, those mentions, we can then have a share of mentions to get a rough market share that corroborates and actually correlates very highly with the share of purchase occasions. We see grocery, the predominant channel, significant lead, and we see here's Walmart neighborhood has about 3 share, and then we've color-coded where it's growing. So grocer actually grew a bit, and we see that, Kroger's had some good results, Publix has had good results. Albertsons Safeway has actually seemed to kind of gotten rid of some of their bad stores and had a modest bit of turnaround. Target, well documented in the trade press that they've been having struggles. Costco was actually down a bit. Value grocer, and again, take that number with a little bit of a grain of salt. And if we go over to online, there actually was an increase. Traditionally, it had been 1.4. It went up slightly to 1.6. And let's compare to the millennials again. Here they are. And actually, there are a bit of differences that may be worth noting when you're, still in the industry, say 10, 15 years down the road, and it has some actual impact on the future. But you can see there's definitely this bias of younger shoppers toward smaller formats. We see it, they love Target, but we see that the drug chains tend to do better, CVS and Walgreens, Trader Joe's small format. Value grocery was the only one that really didn't. C-store, and there is a decided difference in online, but even 2.6 still is fairly modest among this target that really doesn't account for any disproportionately high amount of volume in this sector. So let's take a look now at this online and what's going on. Well, the purchasing level actually went down slightly from 34. That's actually not slightly, that's meaningfully. Maybe doesn't, it's at the threshold of statistical significance, but it's down 34 to 31, and particularly given all the effort and the rollouts and the expansions of particularly curbside pickup and the deals, that is noteworthy that that number actually went down. And now here's what's been the dynamics as we decompose that. So the first 2 years we didn't break out curbside pickup. This is regular purchasing, 4.2 and 4.3, pretty much flat. It actually went down a little bit when we added curbside pickup, and you can see those that do only pickup and those that do both delivery and pickup. So here's where curbside pickup may have had a positive benefit. It tended that the people that now tended to use both formats in absolute regularly went up, so it got a bit more purchases per buyer. It didn't get you any more buyers overall. But the bigger story here is this, which has a very high degree of putridity. I mean, those stated loyalty numbers are horrible. And the way we get those numbers, and it went up a little bit from 11 to 15, but we're dividing this 4.5 divided by 31. We call that a stated loyalty number. Now, the industry standard for any brick and mortar, even the worst one, is 65. The industry standard is about 75, meaning if you get them in the door, 75% of them are going to buy at least 6 times. Here it's 15%, so it is 1/5 where it needs to be a viable outlet, to have a, you know, and it really is repeat purchasing that is the future of the viability for any high frequency category. So you can just see that it's horrible, and we're going to talk about some other data that corroborates that. And because we look at some specific banners, and Amazon was the only one to go up, and it's curious that all the grocery banners, whether it be, you know, Publix.com, Wegmans.com, all of them, we just aggregated as one. That went down significantly, and I don't know if a day goes by where I don't see some, you know, trade press story about rolling out to, you know, Des Moines, Iowa. It's like that doesn't really seem to be impacting the overall penetration of some of these online formats. And here's that 34%, 31% penetration, and here's the non-purchasing. Target.com, they went down, which corroborates with the fact that they got out of online curbside pickup. Why'd they get out of curbside pickup? Well, our data would suggest it might be there's no demand for it. Still only 1% of the population is doing it regularly. And they're not very happy with it based on their stated loyalty. I mean, Peapod's been hacking around in this industry for 20 years, and they still haven't made much of an impact. And I don't know if Dialhold's out there saying that they're making any great money from it. Certainly if they were, they would have to state it as a material performance and a material metric. So, I mean, a lot of these guys, they've been out there, and there's just, so we're just talking about the demand side. I haven't even started on the supply side, which is a complete mess as well. And I won't get off on that tangent. So let's now go into the strong agreement with trendy concepts, and the same exact conclusion. I think I just did even a copy paste from last one. I mean, there's a long way to go before these things go mainstream, but there's clearly a market, so you don't dismiss it entirely. Organics is still very low. Only 11% of the people this year said they regularly buy organic drinks and snacks. Now, yes, if it was produce, that number would be higher, and based on some other research we've done, that would be about 40%. But this is a high velocity kind of mainstream categories everybody's buying, and only 11% of them buy anything that on a regular basis that they agree with. So, and it's a little bit higher on, you know, 18 to 34, a little over 20, but that, again, that's still 80% are not buying organics. We noted that trend toward low-cal and diet drinks, that it gets old as you get older, it becomes more important, which suggests and kind of underscores why there's been some struggles with the diet soft drinks and some of the other diet products. I mean, we see it in many different categories that diet is underperforming quite significantly regular calorie products. The whole aspect of showrooming, I mean, that's a joke that anyone would be even writing about it in the context of grocery, because just not a factor, 5% of the people doing it. And then finally, are they heavy shoppers at all? And only 10% agree that they're heavy online shoppers. Now, that's not to say we've done research that shows there's certain categories like baby, cosmetics to a lesser extent, but still meaningful, vitamins. I mean, so those sectors that do well online in our industry are there. It's just the vast majority of them do not do well online, and grocery in particular, and I'm not talking produce, of course, I'm talking consumables, stuff that will stay fresh, doesn't have a shipping issue theoretically. And so one of the inhibitors of that is that you're asking that people aren't heavy online buyers to begin with, and then you're asking them to engage in buying categories that by their nature require frequent purchasing. So that in and of itself is going to inhibit a lot of engagement in high frequency categories. It's just that people aren't there yet. Even younger shoppers, 18 to 34, are only at the slightly above average. Last year it was quite a bit above average, but still 15%, not that big. So what do we conclude from all this stuff? Well, first of all, and this is why we started this study to begin with, is really to show the efficacy of promotion. I said it doesn't have to be a bad thing. Stop all the cliches and the needles in the arm and get off the cocaine and all the other trite cliches that people love to bring to bear that are never supported by data. So the data is pretty compelling, not only here but in any number of places. That more promotion increases sales, and the weaker promotions in the industry have been a meaningful source of sales trends. However, or not however, before I get to that, so in particular, very heavy buyers are affected by promotions. We see that cause and effect. That's not to say there's not a diminishing return, but we've been able to draw that correlation between deceleration in the declines in the sector and the stability in deal participation levels. As I mentioned, there also is a point of diminishing return, particularly with respect to tactics. The future is grim for Sunday coupons and circulars. Participation for the younger shoppers is well below the average. Now, you could make a case, I guess, that they will increase their participation once they get older, and we certainly probably have that data to make that case or refute it, but just didn't look into it. Only so many things I can look at, but I mean, that would require a pretty major shift in participation to get it up to national level. So really then the question is, how are people going to get their deals? They certainly want their deals, but the coupons and the circulars, the old school tactics, are not performing that well. And digital coupons a poor replacement, so that's not how they're going to do it. Participation is low and declining. In-market results are poor. So on the bigger issue, the one that there's probably the more interested in, I'm making the call. Online grocery is failing. You mean there's challenges, Kurt? Nope, failing. Why am I so adamant about calling it out the way it is because to the extent that people want to see success and make money, you have to understand that there's certain reasons why that hasn't happened yet. And first of all is a demand issue. People just aren't buying at near the levels they need to and with the regularity they need to make this thing a success. So what is that data? So this penetration is still pretty low. I mean, a third of the people, less than a third, given all the amount of the investment and attention, and that actually is down. Loyalty, though, that's what's the thing. That's breathtakingly poor. I mean, that's horrible. So the norm is 5 times. They got to get a 5-fold increase to be at parity with bricks and mortar. And curbside pickup does appear to have generated modest gains, but I mean it's still extremely low, only at 1%, And even at the regular, that got bumped the regular purchasing of e-commerce to 4.5. I mean, that's, as I mentioned, lower than Rite Aid. Brick and mortar, that's still where it's at. The preference remains solid. That's not going anywhere. It's not. I mean, so sorry, those in the business press that may be less, and maybe start typing out another article, because the death of brick and mortar grocery is not at hand. It's doing well. It's solid, or relatively speaking. I mean, the industry in general is in the doldrums, and maybe some softness in grocery is a reflection of that, but people aren't fleeing en masse for online for our CPG. Marginal shifts in preferences when viewing the highly overrated millennials. They do prefer smaller format, Target, online, and so that gives some guidance to where the future may lie. Target's woes in grocery, as revealed by management, were also seen in this study. Regular purchase levels fell pretty substantially. And Trader Joe's is actually bigger. More people shop there regularly than Whole Foods. And so discount grocer, I suspect that's a reason why that number dropped. More broadly, though, there just seems to be this general trend towards smaller format. Value grocery, C-store, Trader Joe, even drugstores creeping up modestly over time. So what can be done? Well, first of all, with respect to trade, our recommendation is to hold the trade rates at 15 to 20. I mean, even if you were able to, if you had the chutzpah to go to the major national retailers and say you're cutting trade, which I don't think, I mean, having seen a lot of tough-talking people that get all weak at the knees when it comes time to take a price increase or cut spending, that's never going to happen. But there's actually a business rationale to not even, fight that fight. It's just a question of getting smarter with how you spend the money. I could also make an argument once you get smarter, you should be spending more. There's no reason you couldn't and shouldn't spend at 25, 30, 35%. We've tracked plenty of categories spending that rate and doing quite well and spending their money profitably. Food companies and grocers. Stop investing in online grocery until you figure out why there's such a high level of dissatisfaction. So here's the empirical evidence. Once again, Peapod's still stuck in the mud, 20 years and going. Target withdrew from curbside. Walmart saw decelerating trends in online. And the failure of online major retailers to even divulge their online sales suggests it's not that big, because, I mean, if it was material, they'd have to divulge it. I mean, it also begs the question, is this even worth investing in? Or is there, I mean, why is this so appealing? There's certainly no evidence that there's this big pent-up demand for this particular, for grocery. For baby, yes. For vitamins, yes. For grocery, no. This is 4 straight years that there have been no meaningful improvement. I'd also treat organics as no more than a niche opportunity. I mean, all the CPG companies going full bore with all these major line extensions and revamps, I mean, they're just going to get hurt. It's just not going to be pretty, and you kind of see it. We track it all the time. I mean, the rate of sale of the typical organics line that is in the mainstream set is just well below a non-organic. I mean, so that's not to say there's not a niche, and certainly Whole Foods is evidence that there is some appeal to it. But I mean, certainly that was a predictable failure. Wild Oats not succeeding at Walmart, and it has nothing to do with, well, it's not a fit for the rural and the lower income consumer. It wasn't a fit for just the market in general. To a mass retailer that requires high volumes to justify space. Whole Foods even, that their struggles corroborate what we've seen, a slight downturn, slight, not dramatic, but slight in organics. But there's a big broader issue on there's just so many cliches that are talked about online and millennials and organics and all kind of more broad macroeconomic issue we call the bifurcation of America. I mean, that's a kind of a fancy ways to say division, but it's really more than a division. It's not, it implies a division and then two sides heading in separate paths. And you kind of see that manifested itself with even our political environment where they talk about the elites and everybody else. I mean, the mass market is not shopping heavily online. They're not buying organics. You know, they're not looking at health and wellness particularly heavily, but there is a meaningful upscale segment of the population that is. And it's almost as if there's two totally separate worlds out there. And all you really see written about is the upper 20% that has the money to spend, that is seeing increased incomes and doing a lot of these, you know, what we call the trendy things. But the mass market just isn't there, and it really is incumbent upon manufacturers, retailers, brand managers, sales managers to kind of incorporate and integrate that into their worldview of our industry, the way things have kind of transpired, that people seem to be turning their back on the mass market where it's actually the vast majority of the money is. And it's really almost treated as a separate country, the kind of the differences in the preferences. So I see the sign, Dustin's trying to scoot this soapbox from under my feet, so I'm going to turn it back over to Dustin and thank everyone, and I'll open it up for questions.